To the south of Route 153 on the way to Fairhope is a large hill. There are no mountains in that region of Ohio, but that hill by local standards is a magnificent hill. Early settlers called it Roberts Mountain in honor of John Roberts, one of the area's earliest settlers and a man known to be a formidable boxer. It is up to the side of Roberts Mountain that the people of that region often go, maybe as an adventure for the young or as a simple reminder to the old that there is strength still left in them. Lovers will find some lonely place up its side, stop and then gaze down upon the farmland to the south or look out upon the lights of Canton to the northwest. It has undoubtedly been the place of more than a few expressions of love. But upon the late October morning, which we would like to consider, something other than love is blowing in the misty breeze. While others might wait for a more hospitable day in terms of weather to take their hike up the side of Roberts Mountain, on this particular day, one man is to be found. Slowly he walks up the trail that thousands have walked before him. And then near a massive oak tree with leaves of orange, yellow, and brown still drooping, waiting to fall, he stops. Coming up to the tree, he stretches out his hand so as to lean upon that cherished timber, and then with the wind blowing and the gray clouds hanging low, he begins to cry. It's not the cry like that of a child, but a low, sobbing sound. Like the moisture-laden leaves hanging around him, he is weeping, quietly at first, but then louder. His pain must be deep. He groans and mumbles words. What is that we hear? It's a name, a woman's name. Oh, Karen. 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 Between his sobs, the name is clear, expressed in the dearest of ways. Who is this man? And who is Karen? Why is this man weeping? That, my friends, is what this story is all about. When Jim first met Karen, it was, as he often would say, love at first sight. They were both young in their early 20s, and life was as rich and full as it was filled with poverty and uncertainty. Jim was working at a local auto parts store in the outskirts of North Canton and had stopped in one day at the local Pizza Hut for lunch. He had frequented the place often in the past many months, but never before had he seen the beautiful blonde hair and blue eyes that were to meet him that day. Karen was working as a waitress. As he entered with a co-worker named Lewis, Karen walked up to ask them the courtesy question that was so commonly asked back then, smoking or non-smoking? Jim's thoughts suddenly turned away from food and his friend to ponder the greater question, who is she? Karen's name tag revealed her name, and her hand revealed no ring, though she wore several rings on fingers other than the one at which Jim quickly glanced. Jim estimated her age to be close to his own. She spoke with no discernible accent, so Jim figured she must be from somewhere nearby. Though Canton was a large city of some 80,000 residents, still Jim wondered, how did I ever miss seeing her? For the next 3 weeks, Jim went to Pizza Hut every day for lunch. Lewis was quite agreeable to the choice of the eating place for the first few days, but when it stretched into the second week, he asked Jim if they might go somewhere else. It was then that Jim told Lewis, have you noticed the waitress named Karen? You mean the blonde? Yeah, that's the one. Oh, so that's it, Lewis replied. You've been struck down. Shall I arrange for your funeral now? Or should I wait until you learn that she's not interested? Very funny. Well, I'm going to ask her out on a date, and who knows what might happen after that. Jim had from his earliest youth professed to be a Christian. The fact of the matter is, pretty much everyone in Canton professed to be a Christian, or so it seemed. Canton was in the heart of Ohio's Bible Belt. It was Canton, Ohio, that long after the Supreme Court ruled school prayers unconstitutional, continued to have a minute of meditative silence each day as school began. The school board thought meditative silence sounded vague enough to quiet anyone wanting to make a stink about it, but everyone knew it was meant as a time of silent prayer, and most of the kids did just that each morning. Karen was elated at the thought of going out with Jim. She too had noticed him. He was a good-looking fellow with a muscular body, great smile, and deep brown eyes. Jim had attended college for 2 years at the local community college before being offered the job at the parts store. Jim always said that he had enjoyed college, but that he wasn't the best college material. Jim was smart. He just wasn't studious. While others were able to concentrate on their studies, his heart and mind always seemed to be somewhere else. Karen had finished her bachelor's degree program at Taylor University with the hope of teaching in an elementary school. The job at Pizza Hut was just a temporary holdover until she heard back from one of the area's public or private elementary schools at which she had applied to teach. Their first date finished with a hike up the side of Roberts Mountain. Karen's family had moved from Marion to Canton during her college years, so everything was quite new to Karen. Though she had enjoyed her share of dates and boyfriends through the years, Jim was, in her estimation, everything she could have ever wanted. A Christian, good-looking, smart, a hard worker, and someone whom she believed would faithfully love her and care for her. Within 6 months, Jim and Karen were engaged. And after the end of her first year of teaching, 3rd grade at Marymount Academy, they got married. Her class of 18 children was invited to the wedding. It was a beautiful day and truly the beginning of a beautiful marriage. After a few years, children were born to Jim and Karen. First James Jr., whom they called JJ, and then 2 years later, little Rebecca. By this point, Jim was the manager at the auto parts store, and though the work schedule was at times grueling, the pay was quite good. Karen's work at the school went from being full-time to being part-time. She was a good teacher, so she did tutorial work on the side, helping children to learn to read. They bought a house, owned a van, which Jim kept in the best of condition, thanks in part to his knowledge of automobiles. They were active at the Salem United Methodist Church, a church full of young couples like themselves, and enjoyed their summer vacations to the max. Each year they would go up to Kelly's Island, just north of Sandusky, and there rent a cabin at Kelly State Park. The kids looked forward to it. Everyone was together. They were family, and life was good. And then, in one day, it all began to change. The Johnsons, an elderly couple who lived in the Cape Cod next door, had decided to sell and move to Florida. Jim and Karen hated to see them go. They had been truly wonderful neighbors. Frank Johnson, whom JJ and Rebecca affectionately called Uncle Frank, had been a great help to Jim, giving him advice on such things as weed control and what to look for when buying a gas grill. But in a single day, they were gone, and a new family was moving in. Truth is, the kids, while sad about the Johnsons moving away, were excited at the thought that maybe the new neighbors would have some kids their own age. JJ was now 8 years of age, and he dreamed of having a good friend who might live next door. The new neighbors did, in fact, have children, 2 children, Mark and Amy. who were almost the same ages as their own. As Jim walked across their lawn to meet these new neighbors, there was no way that he could have prepared himself for what was about to happen. For upon coming to the door, carrying a cherry pie that Karen had made as a sort of home-warming gift, there to meet him at the door was, without a doubt, one of the most stunningly beautiful women Jim had ever seen. Karen was a good 6 inches shorter than Jim, but this woman was nearly his same height. Her hair was jet black, her eyes were like black diamonds, and her mannerisms so refined. For a moment, Jim felt like he was back in the 6th grade looking at his school teacher. She was probably the same age as Jim, or pretty close to it, yet she seemed so mature, so poised, and so much in control. Jim suddenly became conscious of his sloppy appearance. He was wearing an old Cincinnati Reds t-shirt and a pair of ill-fitting jeans. It was not as though Jim had, upon marriage, suddenly let himself go. Jim was still in very good shape, and he still bore that great smile, the very thing that had won the heart of Karen many years before, but he was clearly not prepared for the moment. He blurted out some words of welcome. The words, I'm married, and my wife, Karen, came out. Her name was Janet, and her husband's name was Phil. Phil was a dentist. Oh, great, Jim thought to himself. He's well educated, and I bet he's good looking too. Jim recalled reading something about dentistry being one of the highest paid professions in the United States. Yet, if that was the case, why would they be living here, Jim thought to himself. The area was strictly middle class. It wasn't a poor area by any means, but it wasn't Briarwood either. Briarwood was the area's most prestigious neighborhood. As Jim was preparing to exit, Phil came up behind Janet and stuck out his hand. He's balding, Jim thought to himself. And with that, a genuine smile came over Jim's face. Upon returning to the house, Jim told Karen about the new neighbors. He told her about Phil, about their 2 children, and how JJ was certain to be happy about potentially getting a good friend right next door. But he said almost nothing about Janet. Oh, well, she's taller and has real dark hair, is all Jim said when prodded for more information by Karen. Look, Jim said, why don't you just go over and meet her yourself? I'm sure she'd like to meet some new friends. Jim's tone of voice was, he later thought to himself, rather harsh. He seldom ever spoke in a harsh way to Karen. He wondered if she detected it. He wondered if Karen could sense his thoughts about Janet. Janet, he thought to himself. That is a nice sound. Jim and Janet. Disgusted with himself for even thinking such a thing, he physically shook himself and set off to go fix something in the garage. He would have mowed the lawn. The lawn actually needed to be mowed, but he didn't want to have to potentially see his new neighbor or be seen by her. Over the course of the next few years, the relationship between Jim and Phil grew. Jim thought he actually liked Phil quite a bit and could begin to understand how Janet would have been attracted to him. Like themselves, Phil and Janet were Christians. Karen invited them to join Jim and herself at Salem, but they chose to attend the Lutheran church on Maple Avenue, heading towards the high school. Their children did become the best of friends, and more than once, there was even some brief discussion about taking a vacation together. Jim found himself absolutely torn over such an idea. On the one hand, just to be around Janet would be, he thought, like a dream come true. Indeed, Jim did dream about Janet, not only at nighttime, but even through the day. When he drove in at night, he always glanced over at their house to see if maybe Janet was around. He noticed everything about her. The car she drove, the way she dressed, the way that she combed her hair. But to actually spend time with her, or with them, Would she notice his interest? Or what about Phil? Or what about Karen? Jim had become an obsessed man. Inwardly, he hated himself for it. He hated himself for his thoughts. He hated himself for the mere fact that he would or even could think of someone other than Karen. Karen had been his life. She was as good and caring as anyone could ever find. What demon was this that was driving him so? It wasn't sexual lust. His thoughts about Karen weren't sexual, at least not usually. They were more relational. When Karen was in a bad mood, he thought about Janet. Janet, he thought, probably wasn't like Karen. In fact, there were a lot of things he thought he liked more about Janet than about Karen. He'd always liked Karen's blonde hair, but Janet's jet black hair was even more attractive, he thought to himself. Both had borne 2 children, but Janet's figure was better than Karen's. There were these constant comparisons going on in his mind, and though Jim had actually come to very much like Phil, he wondered how Janet had ever settled for someone like him. He must have had a full head of hair when they met, he reasoned to himself. More years went by. Never was there any actual unfaithfulness, but all the while Jim's heart grew distant from Karen. Outwardly, he remained the same towards all parties. Karen still thought him the loving, fun, strong husband she had always had. There was never the slightest hint of anything wrong, and Jim was committed to it staying that way. And then one day, Karen and Rebecca were no more. The police said that it was the fault of a piece of metal that had fallen from a truck. The piece of metal, only about 6 inches in length, had fallen to the road only to bounce up and hit an old man's car as he followed the truck. The metal piece crashed through the windshield and instantly killed the man, whose vehicle in turn swerved into Karen's way. The whole incident probably took no more than 15 seconds, but 2 adults and 1 young girl were killed while the truck driver, ignorant as to what had just happened, drove onward. The blow to Jim was incredible. Though the church rallied around him and JJ in a way that was truly wonderful, many later privately remarked that Jim's remorse seemed odd. For although he cried, it seemed as if something else was on his mind. Little did they know that what haunted Jim were not only his feelings of self-condemnation, as if he had caused the accident, but also his thoughts about Janet. Janet and Phil were at the funeral. Several times in the weeks and months that followed, Janet brought over a meal. One time in bringing the food in, Janet actually brushed against Jim. There was certainly nothing meant by it, yet Jim wondered. About this time, Jim decided that it might be good to just move away. Not to a different area, but maybe to a different house. By now, JJ was in junior high, and his relationship with Mark next door was not nearly what it had been years earlier. The house was filled with memories of Karen and Rebecca, and Jim and JJ agreed that a different environment might help both of them. So they moved, just 3 miles away, still within the same school district, but a place for a new start. At the beginning, it seemed good. Both Jim and JJ found the new house time consuming. They worked together in repainting and fixing up the house. The lawn at the new place was in bad shape, so all the years at the old house, plus the careful instructions of old Frank Johnson, were now put to good use. But it wasn't over. Janet came by one day with a housewarming gift. It was a cherry pie, just like what Jim had brought to Janet's house years back. Janet told Jim that Phil had lately been feeling ill, and she was concerned for him. He had been coughing steadily. Yet after weeks of trying various medicines, the cough still had not gone away. Janet even hinted that it might be serious. And for the first time in all the years that Jim had so carefully watched Janet, he saw her broken, tender, vulnerable even. Inwardly, he desired to put his arms around her and hold her close to himself, but he knew he dare not do so. He suggested that he pray for Phil, which he did, and with that he shook Janet's hand and said goodbye. Phil's condition worsened, and eventually he had to be taken to the hospital. Phil was suffering from some sort of disease of the lungs that left him with little oxygen. It was not expected that he would survive. He did not. The funeral at the Lutheran church was very good. Many spoke of their love for Phil, and Jim also spoke up about how he had grown to really appreciate the friendship of Phil. Many cried and many laughed, but when it was all over, Janet was still there, and Jim was still there with her. They spoke briefly about their common loss, both losing their mate, though Jim had also lost Rebecca. As Jim left the church building that day, his mind began to ponder this strange turn of events. Could it be that God was behind all of this? Could it be that what he so desperately wanted all these years might actually now come his way? Maybe God was blessing him, he reasoned to himself, for having kept himself pure all these years, never telling anyone, never even hinting that his heart had long ago grown away from Karen and towards Janet. Maybe that was it. Maybe God was saying, yes, my son, because you have kept yourself under control, now I'm going to give you what you have always desired. Jim knew he could not act on anything too quickly. Too quick of a move, and it would be considered inappropriate, he thought to himself. Yet if he waited too long, who knows who might move in on Janet and try to win her heart. That would be unfair. After all these years, she's mine, Jim reasoned to himself. And so after what Jim deemed an appropriate mourning period of 4 months, he got up the nerve to drive by Janet's house one March afternoon. Janet seemed surprised to see Jim, but also pleased. He left. He felt neither out of place nor too forward as he made his way into the living room. He had, after all, been in the house on a good many occasions through the years. As they sat on 2 sofas that faced each other, they spoke about the past, about Rebecca, about the good years of living next to each other. And when the conversation finally came to a bit of a lull, it turned to the future. Janet said she didn't know what would happen next. I'm just looking forward to getting the kids through the school year. After that, I don't know, she said. I do, replied Jim. What's that? What's in our future? Janet asked. What about something really fantastic? Jim said with a smile on his face. Well, that sounds fun. And fun. Well, that sounds good too. And something that seems like it just always should have been. Well, Janet said with a smile on her face, and what could that be? Jim took a deep breath and then said what he'd wanted to say for years. You and, he hesitated, you and me. As he said the words, his heart raced faster than he thought it had ever gone. He wondered if he should look away, or should he just stand up and run out of the room? Should he say anything more, or just wait? You and me? Janet said. Was she about to laugh? What had her thoughts been all these years? The fateful moment was now here. Jim, she said, that is a wonderful thought. Jim waited for the but, yet no words or condition or compromise or retraction followed. Not then, nor in the following minutes, days, weeks, or months. As things would be, Janet confessed that she too had noticed Jim right from the beginning, and while she never admitted to have actually desired Jim over Phil, and she always spoke of Phil in the highest and best of terms, she did express her long-standing admiration of Jim and how it had passed through her mind on more than one occasion that if anything were to ever happen to Phil, that she would consider herself happy to have someone like Jim. Jim thought himself to have died and gone to heaven. At first he thought, I've waited this long, let's just go real slow. People who knew them both seemed genuinely pleased at the notion of Jim and Janet dating. It seemed like a great match. JJ also seemed pleased, though he would often speak with tears in his eyes about missing his mom and missing Rebecca. Well, Jim would say, in reference to Janet's daughter, Amy, just think, maybe you'll get another sister. Days turned into weeks, and then into months. But as time went by, two things took place at one and the same time. For while Jim felt as though he was truly getting to know Janet deeply, and so much of what he was learning about her pleased him, he also began to see that Janet was not quite what he thought she was. Her hair, for example. It was jet black, all right, but she confessed to having been using a dye for better than 10 years. Oh, she said, if you saw it the way it really is, you'd be in for a shock. Her slender figure was not, as he had imagined, the product of some superior breeding, better stock, or incredible discipline, but due to what most would likely consider a mild eating disorder. Jim had noticed early on Janet's refusal of ice cream while Karen would consume it. He had thought her incredibly disciplined. The truth is, she was lactose intolerant. Even her speech was not what he had thought. She had always been one of few words. Jim had thought her to be the kind of woman who chose her words carefully, like a queen or some dignitary. The truth of the matter was that Janet was just not real quick. What she said was always good, but she wasn't quick. With Karen, one dared not even enter into a heated dialogue, for she could match verbal blow for verbal blow. Not so with Janet. With Janet, you had to actually be careful that you didn't run over her. She was more naive, more gullible, less informed, less thoughtful than Karen. Janet wasn't half the mother that Karen had been. Little by little, the dream that Jim had harbored through all the years was proving itself to be an illusion. The Janet that he was getting to know was a good woman, but she was nothing to be compared with the Janet he had dreamed about for so very long. Jim thought long and hard in this. It was, he thought, like buying a house that looks so good on the outside only to learn later that it has been eaten away by termites on the inside, or to purchase a dream car only to later find out it's being held together by body filler. The house still looks good, the car is still the make and model desired. It's just that there isn't quite the integrity that one might have desired. It's not all gold that glitters, is how some have put it. These new revelations cast Jim into a great state of confusion. What if he proceeded with his plans of having Janet as his wife, only to find that he didn't actually want her? Or what if he married Janet and then saw someone else, someone who was who's more like Karen after they were married? Would he then begin to dream about that other woman the same way he had dreamed about Janet? Where was the end of all this? It was at this point that these thoughts led Jim up the side of Roberts Mountain on that misty October morning. And what is it that caused him to weep? It was for the first time in now so many years, Jim actually thought long and hard about Karen. He thought back to his first date with her, and how he had brought her to this very spot on Roberts Mountain. He thought of how he had loved her and how she had loved him in return. He thought of the good years they had had until Janet and Phil had moved in next door. And then this is what really made him sob. He thought of all the wasted years, those lost years, when though he had been with Karen, his heart had been so blinded by the illusion of what might be. All those years when Karen was right there, while his wayward heart kept him from seeing her, enjoying her, loving her. How could he have been so blind? And with that he cried and sobbed, "Oh, Karen, Karen, Karen." Poor Jim. Poor Jim. And thus ends the short story.